All right, welcome back. Thank you for joining us on this very important topic because when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what often comes to mind are ethnic and racial differences, gender differences, but what is less appreciated are those with criminal records. And there have been many people, many of the people who have been incarcerated have been disproportionately Black and brown people, and they want to get back into the workforce and contribute to society, but there are these biases around them. And Deborah Weiss, the leader of the Workforce Science Project at Northwestern University School of Law, is here to share some nuances around that and some actions. So Deborah, thank you for being here. If you want to introduce yourself and elaborate more on what you're about to share, please do. Really excited you're here.
Hey, Al, thank you so much for having me. And it is wonderful to be here speaking to this great group of people. I am going to talk about how businesses can support the efforts of people with criminal records to obtain and keep productive employment. And I'd like to particularly focus on what the people analytics community can do in this effort, which I think is a lot and underappreciated.
All right, we'll get after it and I'll get out of your way and I'll come back at the end and we'll have a discussion. All right, enjoy.
So what is the challenge for people analytics? The challenge is we don't have much evidence, and that's what people analytics does. So what we know now that I'm going to go over is some evidence that suggests that there's optimism about what will happen when we hire people with criminal records. But there are also some challenges. And the people analytics community can play a key role in developing better evidence so that we can make hiring and retention efforts work. So let's begin by going over what the criminal records crisis looks like. So we all know that there's a mass incarceration crisis, but there's also something else, which is a criminal records crisis. One of the effects of the digital revolution was a dramatic increase in the availability of background checks. And many employers now use those checks in ways that harm the job prospects of people who could be wonderful employees. So I'm going to get into the weeds and I'm going to discuss a lot of data in this. And because you're all data people, I'm going to encourage you to think about the weaknesses in the numbers we have, and think about how you could do better with the data available to you. So mass incarceration is well known. What's a little bit less well known is the criminal records, the scope and nature of the criminal records crisis. So we have, excuse me, I bet you can hear, I'm going to shut my Outlook off because I think you can probably hear my emails. About half the workforce, think of it, half the workforce has some kind of criminal record. So if we exclude arrest-only records, which is about 8%, though employers do sometimes look at those, we have about 28% misdemeanor, no prison, about 6% felony, no prison, and 2% former prison. So although the formerly incarcerated obviously face the most intense challenges and deserve our highest priority, there is a broad group of people who have never been incarcerated, but who still have the stigma of a criminal record that's going to show up when an employer does a background check. So what do the labor market effects look like of a criminal record? This is where the terrible awfulness of the data becomes a real problem. It is absolutely astonishing, and it's partly a result of having a federal system, partly a result of the fact that it's not a priority. We have terrible information on exactly how on exactly what the labor pool looks like to an employer when they go look at it and how it affects their hiring decisions. So I'm going to patch together information from various sources. We can look at broad government data and figure out who's in and out of the labor market. For people with no record, about 6% are in the labor market. Obviously that fluctuates, but roughly. For people who have an arrest only, about 6%. Once you have even one conviction, even of a misdemeanor, it goes up to about 13%. If you've been incarcerated, it's 20%. So that is an extraordinary waste of human capital. Now, you might argue you don't know exactly why these people are out of the labor market. Maybe they aren't searching hard enough for jobs. In order to answer that, we need to look at what employers see. We do know that 70% of employers do criminal background checks on all employees. What's a little bit harder to find out is what the labor pool that they look at looks like. So based on my own research, which is ad hoc, I will be the first to admit, it's based on the evidence I've happened to be able to get access to, plus pieced together from a few other studies that have been able to look at employer level data. It appears that any criminal record at all produces a 25 to 50% lower chance of being hired. So the data on the right is better than the data on the left because we're actually able to look at people who have applied for jobs. And it's not a pretty picture. So let's think, why do employers do background checks at all? It might seem obvious, but the exact reason is kind of important. Here we have survey evidence with all the shortcomings of survey evidence. 89% of all employers say it's safety. I'm going to spend quite some time on that. The second most common answer is quality of hire. That is also something that the people analytics community can really look into. There are two other reasons that I'm not going to address today because they have other, they belong to other areas of expertise. But safety and quality of hire, the two big ones, are things that the data-driven community can really make a contribution to. So let's begin by thinking about what kind of record the people who an employer sees are likely to have. Again, the evidence on this, the data available on this is not good. I have to rely on the data I've been able to get access to because there's not much that's published. There's hardly anything that's published. I have access to a hospital system data. 6% of the applicants have more than a minor traffic offense. Let's see how that breaks down. So if we look at seriousness, it breaks down to about 30% have a fine-only misdemeanor. It's relatively unserious. And remember, I've dropped the minor traffic offenses. Serious misdemeanors are the big category. That's around 60%. Felony is around 10%. As far as the type of crime, the really big one is vehicles. Now again, remember, I've dropped minor ones. So we're talking about somewhat more serious vehicle violations. These could include DUIs, reckless driving, leaving the scene. The second most common is property. And then the one that, of course, everyone's most concerned about is violent. That's about 8%. So let's go to our first rationale for not hiring people with criminal records. That's safety. And the idea is that people with criminal records are more likely to endanger the safety of coworkers or customers. And along with a general concern, employers usually cite the possibility of negligent hiring liability. And there are a lot of horror stories going around about huge verdicts. There is no really good study, there's no good study of this at all, but I have personally done some research. I've read over all the large verdicts in the last 10 years, and I can give you a pretty good sense of what they look like. They basically fall in two categories. And by basically, I mean essentially everyone I've looked at. They involve a driving job with a bad driving record, or they involve a violent offense in a low supervision job, and there have already been on the job red flags. So again, that is essentially every major verdict in the last 10 years. Think about how narrow and specific that is. Most jobs are not driving jobs. There are a lot of vehicular offenses, that's true, but that shouldn't affect even people with with bad driving records usually aren't applying to jobs that involve driving. Similarly, violent offenses are a relatively low percentage of applicants, and it's only in low supervision jobs that they lead to trouble. So the typical job on a large retail floor, in a factory, in a call center, all of those are going to be high supervision jobs. And I have yet to find a single case in which you have a large jury verdict in a situation like that. So I think it's fair to say that employers are right to be concerned about these two stop sign situations, but those are very specific and they should be dealt with as individual cases, and they should not be determining general policy towards people with criminal records. So let's move on to our second concern. Our second concern is a criminal record a general indicator of the likelihood that an employee is going to perform well on the job? So again, have to fall back on a very small group of studies, some of which I've done, some of which are other people. This one happens to be one that I was on. This is data from a solution provider. They designed hiring tests, psychometric screening tests, and the data set is multiple firm data. It's conveniently limited to 2 jobs, which allows us to really dig deep into the consequences for 2 different jobs. And it's mostly, though not entirely, good news. When we look at the performance of employees with records relative to other employees, we find that voluntary turnover for all of them is much lower, significantly lower. 18 days if you look at the workforce as a whole. The possible concerns are involuntary turnover. Involuntary turnover is a little higher for sales, and misconduct turnovers are a little higher for the group as a whole and definitely higher for sales. But before you worry too much about a misconduct turn, that sounds horrible, a misconduct discharge. Let's think about what that means. Remember, I've already gone over the information we have about really serious misconduct. Overwhelmingly, when we talk about a misconduct discharge, we're talking about something which you could be denied unemployment compensation for. That is it. That is all that misconduct means. So it includes excessive absenteeism, insubordination, things that are worse than poor performance, but certainly not anything that should be cause for liability concern. So we've got these we've got these greens and these reds. Is there any way we can net these out? Do you look at this and you say, how do I know that that misconduct isn't worse than the misconduct costs are better than the voluntary turnover gains? Well, we did a back of the envelope calculation. Admittedly, it is just that, but we made, I think, fairly conservative assumptions. We first calculated the gains from lower turnover based on fairly reliable data. And we calculated that for the average customer service worker, that came out to about $746 a year. That's a lot. For somebody these are all workers who are making maybe in the low $30,000 range. That's 2.5% of what they're making. That's a huge amount. We also tried to figure out the loss from misconduct. Again, we tried to be cautious. We assumed that every single misconduct discharge was an instance of essentially retail theft. Now, that's outrageously cautious because very few of them are theft. But let's say they were all theft. Even if that were the case, they were so few in number that it averaged out to about $43 an employee. So clearly, in this situation with this data, and we have to be careful because this is going to be very data specific, clearly hiring someone with a criminal record was a huge win for the employer. The costs, the gains from the lower turnover really outweighed any possible loss from misconduct. Now let's look at another data set. This is one which a study I did not participate in, so I'm basing it on the written paper. This was using military data, and the military, not surprisingly, uses a lot of psychometric screening in its hiring. In fact, a lot of psychometrics actually originated with the military. Not surprisingly, also, people with felony records get the most stringent level of psychometric screening. People with misdemeanor records get less. And the researchers found that people with felony records did as well or as better than other recruits on all measures. There was a slightly higher misconduct discharge rate, but again, their analysis suggested none of this was the kind of misconduct that typically people think about when they think about misconduct by people with criminal records. They were simply insubordination. And that by any reasonable measure, the military felt that these were wins, that allowing these people to enlist was clearly a win. Now, strangely, the record for people with misdemeanors is much worse, that people with misdemeanors performed worse on all measures and had higher misconduct. Not egregiously higher, not enough that the military was ready to say, no more. But it was higher. And it seems fairly clear to everyone who's looked at this data that the difference is the psychometric screening, that the investment in higher levels of psychometric screening made a huge difference, almost more difference than the level of the offense to begin with. Our last study is back to the hospital data. Again, this is data that I'm currently analyzing. And here we have very granular offense data that I showed you a little bit of before. The hospital did no psychometric screening. It was just a conventional hiring process. We found elevated involuntary turnover at all levels of offense. What's funny is it was exactly this. It seems to be pretty close to the same for low misdemeanors and felonies. No difference in voluntary turnover, so you don't have the benefit that you had in the first set of data I showed you. And so far, we can't figure out a good way to cut it so we can say interesting things about different job categories. So what is our tentative conclusion about what we know about the performance of employees with records, based on, admittedly, 3 studies, each of them highly limited to specific kinds of employment situations? The thing that really seems to stick out is that psychometrics in hiring pays off. If you use psychometrics in hiring, you pretty much don't have to think about criminal records. You are very likely to get high performance, usually resulting from lower voluntary turnover and negligible increase in involuntary or misconduct. If you don't use psychometrics in hiring, you do get somewhat lower performance levels and somewhat higher involuntary turnover. It's not necessarily enough to justify not hiring people with records, but you don't have quite the, oh, this is a win-win for an employer. So I think the bottom line is, if you possibly can, look into ways for using psychometrics rather than a criminal record for screening, because it picks up the same thing without having the kind of disparate impact that we should all be worried about. Now, what about after employment? The problem with what I've said so far is that it kind of says, all right, if we can't do the psychometrics and they're expensive, or the psychometrics screen somebody out, we're not going to hire them. That may be okay as a short run way to kind of get the process of hiring people with criminal records improved. But in the long run, we still have an issue with people with criminal records who need jobs, who we want to reintegrate into society. And so let's ask a harder question. Suppose we go ahead and hire relatively higher risk people with criminal records, people who the psychometrics might have screened out. Are we stuck with accepting a higher level of separation and of possibly behavior at possibly lower performance? We have one very optimistic data point from the solution provider data. And again, I stress it's one study, but it's all there is. To our absolute astonishment, we found that firms that have more employees with criminal records have less misconduct overall. Think about how extraordinary that is. The firms that hired more employees with criminal records have less misconduct overall, both among that employee group and among employees generally. That makes you think that those firms know something, that they've learned how to manage employees with criminal records and perhaps other employees as well. What does that look like? If you want to be that kind of employer, and I hope you do, the best thing to do is to talk to people who work with people with records and people who are reentering citizens to talk about the kind of post-employment support they need. I do that, and I'll relay to you the kind of things of information I've gotten from them. So let's divide into two different groups. First, you have employees entering your workforce through a transition program. In other words, you reach out to a halfway house or some other form of transition program and say, I want to be the kind of employer that makes an affirmative effort to reintegrate people into society. So when they come in, you're going to know that they have a record. They're going to know they have a record. There is no reason to particularly be discreet here. You're maybe reporting to a parole officer. So this is an issue that you can deal with openly. Here, there are two kinds of things that you can do that you won't be able to do in our next scenario. Number one, you can educate supervisors about the special needs of people who are reentering, and I'll get into what that means in a minute. The other thing is you can have a peer support and mentoring system. Now, that becomes a little bit more delicate because it's one thing to be part of the women's affinity group. Whether people are going to want to openly join the transitioning workers affinity group, the reentry affinity group, may be a little bit more challenging. But I am told by people who have been in that position that if the employer is actually sufficiently clear about their commitment to helping this group of employees, you can actually do that openly and it will be a success, and that they will be very good about helping each other, and that it will also do something to dissipate the stigma. So that's something to think about experimenting with. The slightly more complicated situation is, what do you do about employees entering through the regular hiring process? And then, of course, some of what I'm going to say is also going to apply to people applying through transition programs. Now, here we have to get into exactly what the kind of problems that people face are. Again, I highly recommend working with the kind of experts, subject matter experts in this area, and I'm just going to relay to you, that's not me, and I'm going to relay to you what I've heard from them. Typically what I hear is that people with records and with reentering citizens often have soft skill issues and communication skill issues. Sometimes that's why they end up in the system in the first place. They're arrested, they don't interact with the officer in a way that is going to get them sort of released with a warning. They generally may have weaker soft skills, communication skills. They may also have other issues in their life. If they've been incarcerated, that's going to be made worse. Prison is not a good environment for increasing people's trust and the kind of teamwork and collaborative skills that you want in a normal workplace. So there are a huge number of ways that you can help people like this without marking them as people with a record, stigmatizing them. And when you do it, you can also help your other employees too. So if you have generally available resources, the two that are particularly come to mind are employee assistance programs. That is a program, probably a lot of you are familiar with it, where all employees can call to get support for general problems in their lives. That's very valuable. Another very helpful type of program is training in soft skills and communication skills. Again, as I say, these are the kind of skills that people with records and reentering citizens often can use some support with. And frankly, we all can. It doesn't have to be stigmatizing. You can have learning and development provide optional training, and if somebody's having trouble, their supervisor can recommend that they work on it rather than letting a confrontation or a problem fester or escalate. And my guess is that the firms that we astonishingly found actually do better, have lower misconduct with more people with records, are precisely the firms that have these programs. I can't prove that. The firms in the data set I had were completely anonymous. There's no way I could follow up with them and ask them. But I'm willing to bet that they were firms that were good about this, and it paid off for them. It paid off for them with employees with records, and it paid off for them with other employees. So what's our agenda? And this is an agenda both for HR generally and for people analytics in particular. I hope I can inspire some of you to go back and think about working with other functions in your firm to ask questions. Who are we screening out using criminal records, and do we have to screen out those people? I gave you a list, a very narrow set of high-risk situations. You might want to go a little broader than that, but you really don't want to be using the absolute bar issue for more than those identifiable high-risk situations. Then ask, are we using all possible alternatives to records? Do we have psychometric screening, other screening methods that get at possible behavior in the work issues without having to use the mark of a criminal record? If you really want to be a great corporate citizen, you can go work with transition programs. You might also want to ask, and this is really getting into a deeper dive, but it's a great one. Ask how are people, do the same kind of work we were doing. Ask how are people with records performing. Can we identify best fit jobs and worst fit jobs? So in our data, customer service was a best fit job. Sales was a little riskier, maybe not risky enough to justify not hiring, but riskier. Post-hire, you want to ask, are we providing adequate employee support and training programs? Are we training supervisors? And do we have peer support groups? So thank you so much for your thoughts. I would love to talk with you afterwards. I'll be at the table, and if we have a few minutes, I'll talk with Al now.
We do, and thank you so much, Deborah. I mean, this is a really, like I said at the outset, really important topic, yet it's a blind spot for many when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and it's such a large segment of society. So first off, thank you for elevating it, particularly for Black and Brown people, those who have been disproportionately affected, by the practices here in the United States. So, with that in mind, it's hard to all of a sudden snap a finger and not have any biases against someone who is, has a record. It's not that you can go litigate that and, oh, did you really do it? What were the circumstances? It's pretty binary. If it's in a recruiting process or if you're at a hiring manager level where you're considering this individual ultimately. So my question to you is, how can we get better at empathizing beyond just thinking, okay, this is for the greater good, this is right thing to do? What I heard in what you shared is that there's actually a real business case here. Like, this is something that can not only benefit the individual, but it can benefit the organization. So can you speak to that more? And because I really would love more organizations to be adopting this in a more assertive way.
So one thing is, this is sort of the reverse of what you were suggesting. This isn't so much getting people to empathize more as protecting the process from the fact that they have biases. Even if you're in a state that doesn't have ban the box, I would recommend that you voluntarily ban the box. Now, ban the box doesn't mean you never get to look at a record. It just means that you don't ask on the initial hiring. In fact, the healthcare provider we used had voluntarily banned the box. So you don't look on the initial, you don't ask anyone on the form, you tell your hiring managers, and you got to tell them very forcefully, because I've heard anecdotes that it's not all that easy to get them to pay attention. You say, you are not to ask for this. If I hear you are asking for this, that is a form of discrimination. And I'm not going to, and the company is going to be not any happier about it than it is about any other form of discrimination, which I hope is not very happy.
Yeah. That's from an organizational level. What do you foresee happening on a policy or legislative level on this? Obviously, Lilly Ledbetter, came, a dozen years ago now. We've certainly progressed, here in California and Massachusetts and elsewhere now, we cannot ask prior salary, for example, and that was to protect, gender pay equity in large part. Do you foresee this becoming a national policy, a law at some point, or what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think ban the box is good. I think moving on to the second stage, when we move past hiring into inclusion, that may be where we have a more chance of changing hearts and minds. I think a lot of gay people say that what really helped the gay rights movement wasn't legislation, it was people coming out. And that when people realized that they had friends and family who were gay and they just hadn't realized that, it really changed people's perspective. So I think if you can create an inclusive workplace where people are voluntarily comfortable in sharing the fact that they have a record, in sharing the fact that perhaps they were formerly incarcerated, and people can see that their friends and coworkers are wonderful people, and that the fact that they made a mistake early in their life doesn't mean that there isn't a path forward for them, that may go a long way to changing their hearts and minds.
Yeah, and to your point, it's interesting because the mistake might have not have been a mistake. If I'm a black male, I might say, well, I was wrong place, right time, and I was discriminated against. Therefore, I still have this badge that I have to carry through life. And again, that's not all cases, but it has happened. So I'm finding it really interesting, and I'm kind of wrestling in my mind here because many organizations have diversity groups, right? They have LGBTQ, they have Black groups, they have gender groups, and I'm like, gosh, are we going to get to a point, and maybe there already is, and I'm not aware of, where, hey, I want to get support, and to your point, make visible that, hey, I'm going to talk about, my record. What's your experience in this organization? Are you being discriminated against because of your record? How many people? I think that would be either publicly or in a small private group, very healing and empowering. So, correct me if I'm wrong again, many people who have records probably just keep it in. They probably hide it, right?
Yes.
So creating we talk about psychological safety a lot. Yep. This is kind of an element to create that. So going back to my question, do you know of any examples, or would you advocate for such groups to form?
I do not know of any. I do not personally know of any. As I say, I work with somebody who himself is a re-entered somebody with a record, and so a lot of what I know about the more institutional stuff is from him. And he says that firms that make a effort to work with transition programs, it's out there. I mean, if you're coming in from a transition program, there's no attempt to hide it. And he said, yes, supervisors do become more aware and accepting because they have explicit training programs and they work with people and they learn. So maybe the route to acceptance is the transition program, because there the question of being in the closet, as it were, is not an option. Yeah. And maybe that's the route to greater acceptance.
No, it's kind of fascinating because, we talk about the millions of people who are incarcerated in this country, and it's a big population. And, it is not in most cases, a permanent destination. And, I'm thinking, unsurprisingly, of Shawshank Redemption. And, obviously times have changed, but have they really? Is there going to be a path to not only assimilation, but to success, where they can, thrive? And is that success going to be, certainly it's going to be on the individual, but it's going to be on the organization too, to allow them development pathways to grow beyond the stigma of, you're formerly incarcerated and you have a record. So I just I haven't seen this elevated, particularly within the DEI discussion, enough. And the final thing I'll say, and this is a bit of a non sequitur, this is not probably exclusive in some ways of military coming into the workforce, and making sure that they have groups and support, particularly if they've seen active, combat, where, they have, there's a stigma associated with it, right or wrong. And actually, it's actually just wrong, actually. And as opposed to trying to shun that, embrace it, hold people in safety, allow them to express themselves either with one another or, as a peer in the business. How can you honor, that the wake, the impact, the what they might be struggling with. So. It's fascinating. As you do your research moving forward on this topic, I mean, what do you foresee? I mean, what's the goal of it at the end of the day? The ideal future state, with regards to those with records. I mean, what would you like to see over the next 6 to 12 months?
One thing I would really like is for companies to start looking at this internally themselves. And there is a major company that has been absolutely in the forefront. I mean, it has been perhaps the single most impressive evangelizer for hiring people with records that has a practice of, they say, we throw it away. What they do is they don't ask. They have what everyone ought to have, which is that one, is this a deal breaker? Because there are some, I can see there are certain crimes which you simply don't think your workplace can handle. So they have that one tripwire deal breaker, which they use very sparingly, and then they say, we throw the record away. Wow. Now that may sound like a very progressive policy, and its intention is good. But the bottom line is you then lose the data, and you aren't in as good a position to evangelize as if you can say, we can tell you for sure that people with records perform well, give you the kind of data I have. You can imagine what I've had to go through to get this data, the pleading and then some. I don't expect everybody to share it with academics, though it's nice when they do. But if you can do it yourself internally, and share it at PAFOW. You don't have to publish it. You can run it through legal. You can decide how to. But I think if you can if you can start working on the data and come up with what I've done only better, because among other things, you're going to have better data, I think that will start to normalize this also. It will make it seem like just another DE&I problem. It's not some horrible thing that we all have to tiptoe around.
Right.
It's another challenge that we're all facing together.
Deborah, I say this often, I mean it each time. I mean, I celebrate you so much because, this is not something that many people wake up in the morning and say, you know what I'm going to do today is I'm going to uncover this topic and I'm going to try and make the world a better place. And so thank you for applying your energy and expertise to shed light on this. I mean, it's hugely valuable. As we start to wrap up here, how can people learn more about you, the Workforce Science Project, and Talreos?
Well, thank you so much for asking, Al, and thank you so much for all your support over the years. Al is the most amazing partner. We are so lucky to be working with you. Talreos, the best thing to do is LinkedIn. We are going to be having another Talreos. Talreos is our annual conference, which is how we got to know Al. And Al is a wonderful partner in organizing Talreos. And this year, for obvious reasons, we're doing it online. So we're going to be having another DE&I one coming up. I won't cover this issue, but it will cover other issues coming up on February 4th. And I posted it on LinkedIn. And please feel free to if you didn't get my email address on this slide, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn. And I will be at the table. I assume afterwards somebody will lead me to I don't seem to be real good with this technology, so
hey, you're doing great. If we got to this point, you're doing great.
So if somebody can take me by the hand to the table afterwards, I will be there, and I'd love to hear about your experiences of the participants in here and what they're thinking, what they'd like to know more of, what they've learned themselves.
All right, perfect. All right, Deborah. Well, thank you again. Thanks for being you, and look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully this year. If not, I'm sure we'll be interacting like this before too long. So you be well, and thank you.
You too. Thank you so much.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.